Now, to share his perspective on the efforts of state-owned enterprises to protect South Africa's infrastructure is public infrastructure expert Gundo Maswime. Very good evening to you. Thank you so much for your time. We saw the different leaders of SOEs coming together to try and find a solution to a problem that runs into billions of rands. What is your reaction?
Thank you and good evening. I think the fact that they are able to recognize that the challenge is not only facing an individual parastatal is important. And I think working just by coming together, it will also bring awareness to an issue that goes way beyond the four parastatals. It's bad in municipalities, provincial government departments, every aspect of government is actually affected.
They've come together as a forum to try and find some sort of solutions to theft and vandalism of infrastructure. As they sit down to find solutions and, of course, seeing that one of the loopholes, as mentioned by the police, was that there's a low conviction rate when it comes to those who may be arrested for being part of such crimes. What are your thoughts around that and the possible solutions that should be scrutinized as they try and find a better outcome?
Yes, the police are correct. There is something called the disability thesis. It's when government is expected to solve a problem where legislation actually paralyzes it and makes it difficult for them to solve the problem. If you look at how other countries have approached this, you realize most of the interventions may not actually work in South Africa. In Kenya, as soon as this became a big issue, they closed down the whole industry completely. Immediately, they just said no more scrap metals. It's illegal. There is absolutely not. If you are found with the scrap metal, collecting scrap metal, taking it anywhere, you're arrested. In Tanzania, President Magufuli had the strategy of sending people with copper cables to scrap yards. And if the scrapyard dealer takes the copper cables, it means you are, because they had criminalized taking copper cables to scrap metals. If you then buy and you pay that person, you'll find this person was actually planted by the state. So scrapyards stopped taking copper cables because they were afraid of that conviction. And that seems to have worked for them. But in South Africa, you can't do that. In the UK, you can't do that. In South America, you can't do that. And this has become the fastest growing crime as far as the UK is concerned.
And in recognizing some of these challenges, the overall message that came out of some of the discussions with the four entities is that at the end of it all, service delivery is being hampered. If you look at ESKOM, if you look at PRASA, you see that the people on the ground continue to suffer as a result of this.
Yes, it is a very serious problem. In fact, in some ways, unfortunately, we have not been able to come with exact figures on the extent of the problem. It is obvious that it goes beyond at least 100 billion as far as the CEO of ESKOM is concerned. On his side, it's more than 16 billion already, but just between the companies that have come together, it goes beyond that. But in municipalities, pump stations, they are normally placed remotely because for sanitation pump stations and so on. And the vandalism is so extensive that in some instances we are starting to question, are we losing more money by this vandalism than we are spending on actually building new infrastructure? So it's almost like we are moving backwards just because of vandalism only.
And really moving backwards speaks to the figure that was announced by the four entities today. They say that 54,000 incidents occurred annually, which is massive. Where, in terms of solutions, where will they come from? Because this is a massive number. It speaks to a deep-rooted problem that perhaps may have been overlooked when it comes to heads coming together to find solutions.
I think the solution will come from understanding the modus operandi of those that are behind this crime, because they are just some petty thieves that they are just scrap dealers. They go around collecting the scraps, and then occasionally they will want to enhance their earnings by stealing a few meters of copper cables from sources that are close to where they operate. These ones, they just dig some pilot holes around lamp posts or electricity posts and just light the fires just so that they interrupt the electrical current. But then there are organized crime networks as well that have been implicated in peri-urban areas, Gauteng, Northwest, and KZN. So most of the time, the way they operate is much more organized. Some of them are actually military operatives from armies within South Africa and outside. So these ones are much more brazen because they are actually hijacking even the cars that are transporting cables from one place to another. But unless we close the industry completely and we understand who is taking these cables, because how you deal with the organized syndicates and how you deal with the petty thieves is slightly different. But I think if we know where all the scrap metal yards are, and we have somebody there inspecting and doing random inspections and say, if you can deal with all metals, but don't deal with copper. If you are found with copper, then you are arrested. Because in some instances, they melt the copper so that it cannot be recognized whether it's coming from ESKOM or it's coming from any of the government installations. So I think there has to be, at least they've come together now to understand the problem, but I think the next step is then to work with the police, criminal intelligence, and start understanding how they are operating, and they will take from there. Because we have had instances that some are transported in ambulances, and some is actually perpetuated by the security companies that are actually appointed to stop the theft.
How big is the metal scrap industry? I mean, in quantifying it to rands and cents.
Well, the industry is as big as the amount of theft that we are experiencing now. In fact, I'll just give you an idea. In 1999, the rate of copper per kilogram was about 1 rand 30 cents. The theft of copper cables went very low very quickly because the industry was not doing well. But today, that value has gone up to about 8 to 9 rands. And it's because of the developments in China that are demanding quite a lot of copper. So because it has now become a very lucrative metal to deal with, it's a very lucrative commodity to deal with. Then criminals have now zoned in, they've organized themselves. So if you are hearing, as the ESKOM CEO was saying, 100 billion rands worth of cable theft is being estimated from the last financial year. So you are just getting a tip of an iceberg of how big the industry is when you look at those type of figures.
Very well. Of course, perhaps let's leave it there for now, and thank you for your time. Speaking there to public infrastructure expert Gundo Maswime, speaking there to cable theft damage, the size of it, especially as we've learned that Cabinet has now approved the public consultation process to proposals to restrict the trade of illegally obtaining scrapped and processed metals.